Yeah, thank you, Terry. We are very privileged and honored to be here. We really admire and appreciate the work that Texas Guardianship Association does. From what I understand, mental health is a hot topic for the guardianship community. And for the mental health community, guardianship and the alternatives to guardianship are a hot topic for us. And we've had the good fortune of working with you all before, and I'm sure we'll continue to work together to facilitate good outcomes for individuals and families affected by mental illness in the state of Texas. I want to tell you just a little bit about who we are at NAMI Texas before we get into the three sections of the presentation. NAMI Texas is a 501c3 nonprofit organization founded by volunteers in 1984. We have 27 local NAMI affiliate organizations throughout the state of Texas. Many of the urban counties in Texas are covered by NAMI affiliates. There are large swaths of rural and semi-rural areas that don't have a local NAMI affiliate, and we're always looking for ways to expand our reach to those communities. We are a membership organization. We have about 1,700 members, primarily made up of individuals and families affected by mental illness. And our overall purpose is to help improve the lives of people affected by mental illness, and we do that through education programming offered at no cost, support groups also offered at no cost, and mental health policy advocacy efforts largely focused on the Texas state capitol and state agencies. So section number one, we're going to give some kind of 101 mental illness in the context of guardianships. We're going to start very basic and then get into some details and some of the legal constructs that are at play here. Just to make sure we're on the same page, I'd like to start by defining mental illness. Well, to understand mental illness, we have to understand mental health. And according to the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, mental health includes our emotional, psychological, and social well-being. It affects how we think, feel, and act. It also helps determine how we handle stress, relate to others, and make choices. Mental health is important at every stage of life, all the way from childhood and adolescence through adulthood. Mental health disorders or mental illnesses, on the other hand, are defined by the DSM as a syndrome characterized by clinically significant disturbance in an individual's cognition, emotion regulation, or behavior that reflects a dysfunction in the psychological, biological, or developmental processes underlying mental functioning. Mental health disorders are usually associated with significant distress or disability in social, occupational, or other important activities. That definition is very clinical. It's a bit of a mouthful. On the screen, you see a more simple definition of mental illness or mental health disorder. This is the definition that our national association, NAMI, uses. Over the course of a person's life, experiencing mental health issues can affect their thinking, mood, and behavior. There are many factors that can contribute to mental health problems, including biological factors like genes or brain chemistry, life experiences such as trauma or abuse, family history of mental health problems. It's important to note here that mental health problems are common, but that help is available. People with mental health problems can get better, and many make a full recovery. Put differently, mental illnesses affect more than 1 billion people worldwide. You can see on the screen, 1 in 5 US adults experience mental illness each year, 1 in 20 US adults experience serious mental illness, 1 in 15 co-occurring substance use disorder and mental illness, and over 12 million had serious thoughts of suicide. When you consider the indirect effect of mental illness, the effect on friends and families and colleagues, we have all been affected in some way by mental illness. It's estimated that around 14% of all deaths globally can be attributed to mental health disorders each year. Within the last year, about 17 million US adults experienced delays or cancellations in appointments. So there's a real challenge with access to care. Not everyone, in fact, most people don't get the treatment that they need. 7 million in a year experiencing delays in getting prescriptions, 5 million people completely unable to access needed care. Only 45% of adults who need treatment actually get it, and only 66% of adults with serious mental illness are able to access treatment. These are some pretty gloomy facts, but it's important to keep in mind that recovery is not only possible, it's likely if a person gets access to the right care. Recovery doesn't mean that a person's cured, it means an ongoing process that happens over time. It basically means that a person can get better, that a person can experience a significant and substantial improvement. It means improving health and wellness. It means living a self-directed life and striving to achieve full potential. It means health, home, purpose, and community. These are the things we look for in a person's recovery, and this is how we know that treatment works. Even people, the more severe cases, people with serious mental illness, perhaps people who are under a guardianship, can experience mental health recovery. You see on the screen that these are the prevalence statistics around particular mental health conditions among adults, anxiety disorders being the most prevalent mental health condition out there. I include this slide mostly to illustrate that mental illness is an umbrella term for a wide range of brain-based conditions with a wide range of causes, symptom profiles, and treatments. There's wide diversity in what mental illness looks like and how it manifests in a person's life. The diagnoses that you see here are the best that we have, and they're far from perfect. We'll talk about each one of these. If we have time, we'll get into specific diagnoses. It's no secret that there is a bit of misinformation, in fact, a lot of misinformation. There's a lack of education, there's confusion, and there's stigma around the topic of mental illness. So there's a short section here in this presentation on dispelling myths and setting the record straight. There's a myth that people with mental health problems are violent and unpredictable, but the fact is that the vast majority of people with mental health problems are no more likely to be violent than anyone else. Most people with mental illness are not violent, and only 3 to 5% of violent acts can be attributed to individuals living with a serious mental illness. There is a myth that personality weakness or character flaws can cause mental health problems, and that people can just snap out of it if they toughen up. The fact is that mental health problems have nothing to do with being lazy or weak, and many people need help to get better. There are a number of factors that contribute to mental health problems that I already went over on a previous slide. There is a myth that there is no hope for people with mental health problems. Once a person has mental health problems, they will never recover. That is a myth. That is untrue. As I mentioned earlier, studies show that people with mental health problems can get better, and many make a full recovery. Recovery is not only possible, it's likely if a person gets access to the treatments, services, and community support systems. The fact of the matter is we need to take more than just a medical approach to addressing mental health problems. We need to take a psychosocial approach as well. Community matters a lot, sense of purpose matters a lot, as do medications, psychotherapies, and those types of more clinical models of care. I mentioned stigma earlier. Stigma, just to define it, is defined as a mark of disgrace associated with a particular circumstance, quality, or person. It often takes the form of hurtful remarks, fear of asking for help, an individual being afraid to speak out and ask for the help that they need, and then general lack of acceptance and lack of opportunity. Stigma is shown through research to have a negative effect. It's pervasive across society, and it harms a lot of lives because it affects people's well-being, it prevents them from seeking treatment, and it harms their self-esteem. So we ask everyone to be stigma-free. And there are a number of different ways that you can do that. It can be as simple as adjusting your language, which I'll talk about on the next slide, or it can be educating yourself about mental illness and reflecting the reality of mental illness in your day-to-day life. In other words, when you're having conversations about mental illness, presenting fact-based, research-based information about the topic, rather than talking about the stereotypes and the stigmas that exist in society about mental illness. So we all need to be warriors against mental health stigma. I mentioned the importance of language and terminology. It's all too common for people to use language that further stigmatizes individuals with mental health conditions. One of the primary examples of this is people's unwillingness to use person-first language. So we don't want people to say, your bipolar son. We want people to say, your son has bipolar disorder. That's putting the person first. We don't say, your mentally ill brother. We say, your brother has mental illness. We don't say, your depressed friend. We say, your friend has depression. Just to drive that point home, you would never say, your friend is cancerous, or my father is heart diseased. It's important that our language for mental illness mirrors the language that we use for other illnesses, as mental illnesses are brain-based biological conditions, and the brain is part of the body. And I'd like to shift gears a little bit and talk about some legal tools that are available to facilitate mental health in the context of guardianships. This is far from an exhaustive list of tools that are out there. I would like to commend TGA for their policy and advocacy efforts to improve the legal framework for guardianships. A lot of progress has been made on that. Guardianship laws and mental health laws, which often go hand in hand, are very much a work in progress. And I'm confident that our respective associations will work closely together in the upcoming legislative session to make further improvements to these laws. I want to, start. I'm sure the members of the guardianship, have these same considerations that we do. Is guardianship the best option? It often is not. It's a fairly restrictive option for people with mental health conditions and with other conditions. Where I'm talking about guardianship of the person here. So the considerations that should be made include: is there a written statement of incapacity from the provider? Is the incapacity due to lack of treatment? And therefore, by facilitating access to treatment, could we avoid incapacity and avoid guardianship? Do the benefits of the guardianship outweigh the restrictions and loss of liberty? Are all parties aware of less restrictive options? Will putting a guardianship in place affect the individual's behavior, perhaps in a negative way? We want to factor that in. And is the proposed guardianship aware of possible lifelong duty that they're going to be held accountable for by the court? This is obviously, a life-changing decision, both for the proposed guardian and for the person needing help, because a person's rights and liberties are restricted under a guardianship. As a guardian, they're responsible for the well-being of the person's life, for the duration of the person's life. So it's important to consider all factors before pursuing the option of guardianship. And in some cases, it's the right choice. Some cases, it's not. Guardianship is one of the #1 things that we discuss with people who call our office. And we also discuss the alternatives to guardianship. We discuss medical power of attorney and supported decision-making agreements and psychiatric advance directives. We discuss voluntary mental health services. We discuss involuntary mental health services. And we're going to get into those topics in a bit here. What's right for one family isn't necessarily right for the next. So there's no one-size-fits-all approach to addressing serious mental illness and or addressing lack of capacity among individuals who have serious mental illness. This slide depicts, I'm sure, what many are already familiar with, which is a particular power and duty of the guardian. The guardian of the person has the power to consent to medical, psychiatric, and surgical treatment other than the inpatient psychiatric commitment of the ward. This is straight from Texas Health and Safety Code. So a key carve out here is that guardians can't consent to inpatient psychiatric treatment unless the ward is younger than 18 or it's a residential care facility for intellectual and developmental disability. So the main takeaway on this slide is that guardianship can be a helpful tool to get a person the psychiatric treatment that they may need. However, guardianship does not provide absolute power over the ward's psychiatric care. So it's important to know what other options are out there to facilitate access to care. A common tool that is often looked at and utilized are psychiatric medications. They're a very common part of a mental health treatment plan. They influence brain chemicals, they regulate emotions and thought patterns. They're usually more effective when combined with psychotherapy. In some cases, medications can reduce symptoms so that other methods of a treatment plan can be more effective. So I would say it's rare that medication is the only thing that an individual with serious mental illness needs, but it's common for it to be a key and critical tool that is used to support their recovery. It's often, as I'm sure many know, difficult to help a person adhere to their medication treatment plan. Medication adherence is a particularly significant challenge for mental health conditions compared to other conditions. And under the law, a guardian cannot use force to make a ward take medication. A guardian may consent to medication on behalf of the ward, but the circumstances under which a mental health professional can physically force a person to take a medication is very limited. And sorry, I just advanced this. Let me go back here. There we go. Those circumstances usually come into play when there's a court order in place for a person to take a medication, or the person is having a medication-related emergency. So those are more or less, your only options to force a person to take a medication. So there are other tools that need to be looked at to support a person in taking, the medication that has been prescribed to them for their psychiatric condition. So it's often the case that individuals and families come under the challenge of a person being a substantial risk of harm to themselves or others and being in the community. And that is not a safe place for them to be if they're a substantial risk of harm to self or others. So one of the tools in that case that can be utilized is an emergency detention. And this is Chapter 573 of the Texas Health and Safety Code. This allows a peace officer or a law enforcement officer without a warrant to use their discretion to take a person into custody if the officer has reason to believe that the person has a mental illness and is a substantial risk of serious harm, either to themselves or others. And the law enforcement officer's duty in that scenario is to take a person to an appropriate treatment facility. So, this is a pretty drastic measure, but if the family member or another individual, an adult, believes that the individual has a mental illness and is a substantial risk of serious harm, I think it's often the best thing to do. It's a step that should be taken. Now, hopefully we can de-escalate things before it gets to that point. And so that's the caveat in all of these legal constructs is let's try other things before utilizing these more restrictive measures. But when it gets to the point where it's substantial risk of serious harm, I think in many cases, what you're going to want to do is call 911 and involve law enforcement. If a person is experiencing a mental health crisis, that doesn't necessarily suggest substantial risk of serious harm. There are other options. There is the mental health system run by the local mental health authorities, and they all have mobile crisis outreach teams. There's a 3-digit number for mental health crisis calls, 988, and that can be called by family members or individuals or anyone who's concerned about a person. But again, those are things that come into play less so when there's a substantial risk of serious harm. I would suggest when that is the case, if a person is making a threat against themselves or someone else, going straight to law enforcement is often the best thing to do. It's important to note on this subject that guardians have special privileges when there is a substantial risk of harm. They have the right to transport the ward directly to an inpatient mental health facility for a preliminary examination. So, that is something that individuals and families that don't have the guardianship construct in place don't have the ability to do, but you are entitled to get an examination for a ward at a mental health facility, and you can transport them to the facility for that purpose if you are a guardian of the person. So that's for an emergency detention, and the facility then does the examination and makes the determination, does a person meet criteria to be put under an emergency detention, which is a 48-hour hold in a mental health facility. I should note here, and I meant to say this at the beginning, if you have any questions, please feel free to enter those into the Q&A box, or you can save them to the end as well. I want to make sure you have your questions and comments addressed. So the Q&A box is there for you. There's another option, and that is going to the judge. And in scenarios where there's a very time-sensitive need for a person to be restrained, this may not be the quickest option, but it certainly is worth trying. And sometimes judges can be, a critical tool for you to use in helping a person get access to care. A lot of the time, law enforcement are familiar with the individuals with serious mental illness who cycle through periods of being a risk of harm to themselves or others. And law enforcement can get burned out on responding to the same house every single time for the same person. They do receive training for mental health, but a lot of the time, they're not wanting to utilize their limited resources to keep responding every time there's a blowout situation at a specific household. So that's a scenario where involving a judge may be necessary. So any adult has the ability to file, usually at the county clerk office or the county judge's office, file an application for emergency detention. And you can see on the screen what information must be included on that application. There's a fairly high bar. You need to provide a specific description of the risk of harm. You need to explain your beliefs as to what the risk of harm looks like and how you know that there's a risk of harm, and was it derived from specific recent behavior, overt acts, attempts, or threats. So it's there's a lot of information that needs to be provided to a judge in order to help inform their decision about whether or not an emergency detention is needed. If the judge grants that emergency detention warrant or mental health warrant, the magistrate or the judge may issue to a police officer a warrant for the person's immediate apprehension if the magistrate finds reasonable cause to believe that the person meets criteria for an emergency detention. So 3 key tools for you to use if there is a substantial risk of harm affecting an individual with mental illness. Just to explain the emergency detention process a little more for you, there's a lot of intricacy in the statute, and I won't get too deep into that. As I mentioned, it's a 48-hour period. There has to be an exam within 12 hours, and if the person meets criteria, then they can continue to be held. If they don't meet criteria, and this is a physician doing the exam, then they must be released. And then a person has various rights that apply under an emergency detention, such as they must be told what the emergency detention is, why they are being held, and what the process will look like going forward during that 48-hour period. Chapter 574 of Health and Safety Code spells out what happens if additional detention is needed beyond the 48-hour period. There can be an order for protective custody put in place. This is often the next step after an emergency detention if there's an ongoing need for treatment and the person continues to meet criteria, which is largely along the lines of substantial risk of harm. The order for protective custody has to be filed by the district or county attorney, and there must be a hearing held within 72 hours to see if there is probable cause for a person to continue to be held. Any adult can file an application for court-ordered mental health services, but if a family member is filing the application for court-ordered mental health services, which I'm using to mean the order for protective custody, they have to include a certificate of medical exam, a recent certificate of medical exam. District and county attorney can file it without that certificate of medical exam. The next step is the longer term commitments. And there's really 4 types of court-ordered treatment. There's court-ordered inpatient and outpatient, and then for both of those, there's temporary and extended. So an inpatient mental health commitment is used when the patient needs to be closely monitored to provide an accurate diagnosis, help adjust or stabilize medications, or during an acute episode where a person's mental illness typically worsens. The court-ordered inpatient treatment can be put in place on a temporary basis, which is 90 days, or for an extended period, which is up to 1 year. And then there are outpatient mental health commitments as well. These are less restrictive than inpatient. The patient is released on a conditional basis with a treatment plan, with case management, court supervision, and aftercare. Now, outpatient commitments don't exist in all counties across the state. There are certain areas of the state that are very active in doing these, and there are other areas of the state where they haven't, for whatever reason, they haven't started the process of doing outpatient commitments. And I think that is unfortunate. I think outpatient commitments are a critical tool for people who have shown, as you can see on the screen, demonstrated history of lack of engagement with mental health services. So if a person has continually cycled through inpatient care systems and emergency rooms and the criminal justice system, and there's a revolving door that leads to that occurring, and that is, of course, an inefficient use of resources, then an outpatient commitment can be very effective in facilitating their engagement in treatment. And there's a strong evidence base for outpatient commitments. It's also called assisted outpatient treatment. And we have a number of assisted outpatient treatment court programs across the state, but not enough of them. So, know whether or not this is something that is available in your area, and know that as a guardian, as a family member, someone who's court appointed, you in many cases have the ability to apply for both a court-ordered outpatient treatment plan as well as a court-ordered inpatient treatment plan, and you can go to the county clerk or county judge to apply for those things. Now we're going to shift gears. This is part 2, and talk about some skills and tools that you can use. And this is, I think something that will come into play before you really get to that point where there's a need for outpatient or inpatient commitments. These are communication tools. These are ways of avoiding more restrictive measures from being put in place. So let's talk about, communication guidelines to use when interacting with individuals with serious mental illness. We recommend using clear, short, and direct sentences. Long, complicated explanations can be difficult for people experiencing mental health conditions. They may find those explanations difficult to follow, and they may stop listening. So keep the content of what you say simple. Discuss only one topic at a time, and give only one direction at a time. We recommend you be as concrete as possible. Try to keep the level of stimulation as low as possible, so that the person you're interacting with will be able to listen and understand you. Keep your voice low and calm, keep your body language calm and still, and speak respectfully and carefully rather than accusing or criticizing. If your loved one seems withdrawn and reluctant to talk, pause the conversation, give them space for a while. Don't try to force a conversation. You'll have a better chance of getting the response you want when the individual is ready to interact with you. And you'll notice, just a side note, I use the term loved one a lot. That's because NAMI, a lot of what NAMI does is to support family members who are living with an individual with mental health conditions. So I recognize that's not everyone in the room. There are court-appointed guardians who wouldn't consider themselves a loved one necessarily, but just know whenever I use the term loved one, I'm talking about supporter, champion, perhaps guardian. These are things that those individuals can do to best interact with and support individuals with mental health conditions. So we recommend that you assume that your loved one may not be able to absorb or understand some of what you say to them. You may need to repeat instructions. Be as patient as you can. Be pleasant, be firm. Saying things that contradict with each other or saying one thing and doing the opposite makes it hard for your loved one to understand and trust you. When you communicate clearly and well, you show your loved one respect and create clear boundaries around what you can and will tolerate. Emphasize that these skills are even more important in times of stress or crisis. Those are the best times to use these skills. So we want to take a look at two different techniques that you can use when communicating with a person who is experiencing symptoms of a mental health condition. The first are I statements. I statements focus on the facts without blaming anyone. They allow you to express your personal feelings about what your loved one has chosen to do and say. Using I statements regularly can change the atmosphere in your home. If one person changes their communication style, it often influences how the rest of the home communicates as well. When you get used to using I statements, don't make the mistake of undoing their impact by expressing doubt or by adding something that reverses the point you just made. Say what you mean and mean what you say. Remember, our loved one's thinking is often distracted, disorganized, and can be disturbing. So it helps them when we're clear, calm, and concise. And I statements are helpful in that regard. So an example of an I statement would be, I don't like it when there's smoking in the house, rather than you need to stop smoking in the house. That little shift in language can make a big difference in how the statement is received. We're going to demo this for you. So Becca, you're on here. Have our operations manager, Becca, to walk through this with me. Becca, are you there?
Yes.
Okay, let's demo I statements. So in this scenario, I'm going to be the family member or the guardian, and Becca is going to be the individual with mental health symptoms. So listen to this conversation, take note of your reaction. Becca, I feel frustrated when the car isn't back at the time that we agreed on.
But you said I could use the car.
We did agree you could use the car, but I feel upset when you return it later than you would.
Well, I lost track of time and I don't have a watch, so.
I understand that can happen. However, if you don't keep track of time, then I won't agree to let you use the car. I need to know that you'll follow the plan that we made.
Ugh, you're making a big deal out of nothing. You don't even want me to have a good time.
I disagree. I do want you to have a good time, and I want to be able to depend on the car being here when we agreed that it would be. You can choose to keep this agreement with me by being on time. If you're late again, I'll cancel our agreement for a week. If you return the car on time, I'll let you continue to use it. That's the end of the script. I'm curious, does the conversation sound familiar to you? Is that the type of conversation that you can envision having with someone who's close to you in your life who has a mental health condition? I think for some of you, it may not feel that familiar. For others, it may. Unfortunately, and this doesn't necessarily apply just to interactions with individuals with mental health conditions. This applies in day-to-day life. We often have conversations with loved ones where we use the word you a lot, especially when we're upset. That's how a lot of fights in the household go. And you'll see when we demo the you statement, the marked difference in how it's received and how it comes across. So let's get into that. So when we move away from I statements with our loved one, we tend to feel defensive. We start blaming, we become judgmental, we make assumptions about their motives, we generalize a specific problem to other situations, and accusations begin to snowball. I'm sure some of you know how that goes. There's something that bothers you, and then the skeletons in the closet from last week or last month or the last vacation come to the forefront. That's what happens when we go towards that accusatory path of you statements. We start venting all of our negative feelings. Everything's on the table. Let's demo this. Becca, you make me so angry when you don't bring the car back on time.
But you said I could use the car.
You're always late. You agreed to have the car back home by 6.
But I lost track of time and, I don't have a watch, so.
Well, you shouldn't be driving if you don't know what time it is. And you don't need a watch because there's a clock in the car.
You're making a big deal out of nothing. You don't even want me to have a good time.
I'm making a big deal? Me? You're the one who's irresponsible. You never do what you promise to do, and you're always late. So that, I think you probably hear the difference there in tone, in how it comes across. And so one of the most important tools that you can use is the I statement approach, which is less accusatory and places less blame on the individual who is being approached about a legitimate concern. The next technique is called reflective responses. This technique is about focusing on our loved one's emotions and experience rather than stating our own. We tend to avoid talking to our loved ones about their unusual behaviors and troubled feelings because we're afraid we'll make things worse. In fact, the opposite is true. Often what people really want is to be heard and understood. Reflecting someone's feelings is not the same as agreeing with them. It shows that you acknowledge what they're feeling about something, not whether you feel the same way. When we reflect back on what our loved ones are feeling, it can decrease their distress. We create a sense of trust and connection that makes it easier to have a conversation and learn what may be concerning our loved one. So let's get into a little exercise here. In our conversation, we often want to explain our side or convince the other person to agree with us. Reflective statements simply acknowledge what our loved one has said. I'm going to ask Becca to give me a statement, and I'll show you 2 ways you can respond to it. One is more helpful than the other, and I encourage you to listen for the feelings behind the words, no invalidating or arguing the moment you hear the statement. And there is no one right response to any situation, but there are responses that are more likely to be well received than others. So Becca, you can read the text at the top of this slide.
Why did you have me committed? I don't even need to be in the hospital.
So I have 2 options at this point as the family member in responding to that. I can respond from my side, explaining my position, saying, we didn't want to put you in the hospital. We didn't know what else to do. We loved you. Or I can stay with my loved one's statement and simply reflect it back. A reflective response might be, I can see you're really angry. I guess I would be too if I felt that somebody I trusted had locked me up against my will. I must seem really heartless to you right now. So this is, the second one that I read emphasizes more in the realm of empathy. And relating to where the person is coming from, rather than on the first side, talking about where you were coming from and why you did what you did. When we validate, this is about validation. It helps people feel heard, it helps them feel respected, and it helps them feel less lost. After all, this is still a person who has a mental health condition. They're dealing with the symptoms of that every day. And it's very important that we make them feel heard and understood. We don't have to agree with everything they say, but validating them and making them feel respected and heard and understood goes a very long way. We're going to skip this because I think we just gave you the gist of reflective responses. And we're going to talk a little bit about the warning signs of a mental health relapse. You can see on the screen what some of those warning signs might look like. Because medications and other therapies don't always protect against relapse, we need to know how to recognize these warning signs, even when our relatives are getting treatment. One study shows that 70% of people with mental health conditions can tell the early subjective changes in thoughts and behavior that signal a relapse is coming. 96% of family members studied can readily identify these changes as well. Knowing what to look for means we can act more swiftly to protect someone before a full-blown episode occurs. Trouble sleeping, change in activity levels, trouble concentrating, nervousness, tension, depression, thinking in grandiose ways, thinking that you're being laughed at or talked about can be a warning signs that a more severe relapse may be on the way. So knowing the warning signs and knowing how to respond is key. You'll see on the screen here, we wanted to address the topic of suicide. This is a topic that is often shrouded in mystery and confusion. And we're often, feeling like we're at a loss for how to respond when we have a suicide concern. So let's set the record straight. Most of the time, people who attempt suicide provide clues to their intentions. Knowing what those clues might be and being attuned to them can make all the difference. Fact, talking about suicide with a loved one gives them an opportunity to express thoughts and feelings about something they may have been keeping secret. Discussion brings it to the open and provides an opportunity for intervention. We should not be afraid to talk with someone about suicide because we're worried that it may give them the idea of taking their own life. We should be open and transparent about the topic of suicide and what our concerns around it might be. There's a myth that only certain types of people die by suicide. In reality, there is no specific type of person. There are some demographic factors that contribute to higher risk, but suicide does not discriminate. There's a myth that suicidal people overreact to life events. The fact is that problems that may not seem like a big deal to one person may be causing a great deal of distress to someone else. We must remember that perceived crises are just as concerning and predictive of suicidal behavior as actual crises. There's a myth that suicide is an act of aggression, anger, or revenge. Most people who die by suicide do so because they feel like they don't belong or are a burden on others. And then the last myth, nothing can stop a person once they've decided to take their own life. That is untrue. Most people who contemplate suicide are torn, they're in pain, and they want their suffering to end. They don't necessarily want to die to make that happen, but they can't conceive of another way, and too often their cries for help go unheard. We can all take action to prevent suicide. Evidence shows that providing support services, talking about suicide, reducing access to means of self-harm, and following up with our loved ones are actions that we can take to help people who may be at risk. Anyone can be a gatekeeper to a suicide from happening. We can all play a role. So what should you do? Take the warning signs seriously, take action immediately. An important step is just to ask questions. Have you been feeling sad or unhappy? Do you ever feel hopeless? Do you ever think about dying? Do you ever have any actual suicidal impulses? These are the kind of questions that you can ask, and you'll see these questions are pretty direct. They don't beat around the bush. These are very direct, very specific questions, and we recommend that approach. And then there are other things you can do: staying with them, holding space with them, calling a suicide crisis line, calling the 988 mental health crisis hotline, going to an emergency room, calling 911. These are steps that you can take. So listen and really listen to them. Be clear, transparent, and kind. Share resources, and don't use reverse psychology when you have a concern about someone taking their own life. These are the guidelines to help de-escalate a crisis. I'm going to skip this because we've already kind of hit this. And then if you have a loved one or a ward that presents a risk for a mental health crisis, you want to have a plan in place ahead of time in case you need it. And you can see on the screen what you want your mental health crisis plan to include. You want to have this all documented and written down so that you can reference it when a mental health crisis presents. And then you also want to have a relapse plan in the event that a serious mental illness reemerges in a person's life. They may be going through a good period and everything's looking up, but let's say they stop taking their medication or something triggering happens in their life. What are you going to do to respond to that? How are you going to collaborate? What answers to questions like, how will we know that you're going into a crisis do you have? What will we do if you go into a crisis when there are more mild symptoms, when there are severe symptoms? At what point will we look into hospitalization? At what point might we contact emergency services or law enforcement? This is a collaborative plan between, I'll call them the caregiver and the individual with a mental health condition. Burnout is a real concern and a real challenge for caregivers. It can include emotional exhaustion, depression, boredom, apathy, indecisiveness, physical exhaustion, headaches, muscles, tension, emotional stress, insomnia, irritability, increased anxiety, hopelessness, absenteeism, escapism, and lower self-regard. So being the caregiver and always having to be present can take its toll, and it can leave us in a pretty bad place. So there are two really critical things that we must do to protect ourselves against burnout. We must set limits and we must practice good self-care. This is about creating boundaries, and it's about taking care of yourself. Know who you can talk to as the caregiver, know who you can vent to, know who can provide you with affirmations that you're doing the right thing. And then practice good self-care. Put on your oxygen mask first. And we won't get into specific self-care strategies. It's different for everyone. But just know, there are a lot of tools and resources that you can use for your own self-care as a caregiver. And if you don't avail yourselves of them, then there is a risk that may have an impact on the person that you're providing care for. And I know that that's something that we want to avoid. The last section of this presentation, before we get into any questions that you may have or any comments, are mental health resources. We'll move through these pretty quickly. These are things that you need to know as a member of the guardianship community. I've already kind of mentioned a few of them, but I'll go over them and you can see them depicted on the screen here. The National Suicide Prevention Lifeline is still in effect. Anyone can call if they have a concern about suicide, whether they're a family member, caregiver, colleague, or an individual with a mental health condition. So the Suicide Prevention Lifeline has not been replaced by the 3-digit number 988 for mental health crisis calls. It is supplemented and supported by that 3-digit number. And for a long time, I think that there's been a perception that that hotline is only for people who are at imminent risk of suicide, when in reality, it's for anyone who has a concern about a mental health crisis. And that's mental health crisis broadly defined. So call that number and you will get connected to a trained crisis counselor who can walk you through what the options are and provide support. There's also a specific crisis line for veterans. You can see the number on the screen. And then there is a crisis text line, 741-741, that provides free 24/7 crisis support. As far as community-based mental health resources, people who are living in the community and who need ongoing mental health services. There is the community mental health system in Texas, run by the Texas Department of Health and Human Services. These are the community mental health centers across the state. There are 39 community mental health centers, or LMHAs. They provide services regardless of a person's ability to pay, and they provide a fairly broad range of services for individuals with mental health conditions. They do provide care to people who have not just bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, and major depression, but also other mental health conditions as well, to the extent that they can. This is an under-resourced system that doesn't have the capacity that it needs, but it is there in all 254 counties across the state. There's a COVID-19 mental health support line that you can see 24/7, 365. The number is there. NAMI Texas is a community mental health provider. We provide peer and family-based support groups and mental health education classes, largely for individuals and families. And then there's also the NAMI helpline, which is a resource referral line nationally that's available Monday through Friday, 9 a.m. Central to 9 a.m. p.m. I just wanted to also plug telemental health services. This is a growing option for people. It can be critical for people who live in areas that are underserved by in-person mental health providers. It's well established there's a mental health workforce shortage in the state. So sometimes telemental health is a really good fit for people, especially those who live in mental health deserts. So also called telepsychiatry or telepsych. There are different ways to access these services: federally qualified health center, local mental health authority, as well as from your smartphone. Apps like Calm and Talkspace provide these services on a subscription basis to people with a broad range of mental health conditions. So make sure you know that that's an option. There is the inpatient mental health care system, psychiatric hospitals. There are the 9 hospitals run by Texas Health and Human Services. Access at those hospitals can be fairly limited. They've really become places where people who are under criminal justice-based mental health commitments end up, and so the other populations have been crowded out. But there are ways for people to get into the state hospitals, so know where they are. And oftentimes the local mental health authority is the best way to get access to state hospital services. So linking people up with their community mental health provider can be critical to them getting, if they need it, more intensive inpatient care. You can also, of course, access the network of private psychiatric hospitals across the state through the 211 database. There are county-run hospitals through local health districts. I just encourage you to know what the psychiatric inpatient care options are in your community, and you can always call us for a recommendation. Oftentimes, medications can be hard for people to afford, so I recommend looking into prescription assistance programs if that's an issue that affects you or someone that you're the guardian for. The PAPs are offered through different sources. One that we often recommend is texasdrugcard.com, and it provides assistance for people in meeting their copay for accessing their medications. Mental health first aid is a really great program. We're often taught skills in how to intervene if a person is experiencing a physical health emergency, but we don't learn so much what we can do if a person is experiencing signs and symptoms of mental illness. So that's what mental health first aid is there to provide. It's offered in many different places across the state. You can find a course at mentalhealthfirstaid.org. Lastly, before we turn it over for any questions in the remaining time we have, I just wanted to mention a little more about the NAMI programs. These are all available free of charge. We have peer support groups such as NAMI Connection. These are for any adult who has symptoms of mental health condition. You can access this online, statewide online through Zoom at namitexas.org, or you can reach out to your local NAMI affiliate, and they are likely to have connection recovery peer support groups as well. And then there's the NAMI peer-to-peer free 8-session education program for adults with mental health conditions who are looking to better understand themselves and their recovery. Visit namitexas.org/online programming to learn more and get registered. And then lastly, we have programs for family members. We have the NAMI Family Support Group. This is a support group led by trained family members for any adult with a loved one who has experienced symptoms of a mental health condition. It helps you gain insight into the challenges and successes of other families who have faced similar experiences. And then there's the NAMI Family to Family course, which is taught by family members. It is a designated evidence-based program, and it helps people learn how they can best support the recovery of their loved one. NAMI Basics is for parents and caregivers of people who are under the age of 22. NAMI Homefront is for the military community, family members in that community. That concludes the presentation. I know we don't have much time left, but if there are any questions, I am happy to address them. I do see there's one question in the Q&A. The question reads, what do you suggest for someone who refuses to take medication, but the lack of medication is the cause of disability/incapacity, especially if a guardian cannot force an individual to take the medication? It's a tough question. There's no easy answer there. I think it's a lot about engagement, and it's using the skills that we have as a guardian to nudge the person in the right direction. It's about explaining the benefits and the importance of taking the medication. Our options beyond that are fairly limited, but I remember that there is a mental health system that is there to support you, that has the same goal of helping people access the treatment that they need. So there are service providers at community mental health centers called assertive community treatment teams. They're called ACT teams. These are they provide in-home services. They make home visits. It's a treatment team. They have a prescriber, they have a social worker, they have a peer support specialist, and they can all be helpful in engaging the person who is under your care to participate in the treatment that they need, including but not limited to medications.
Let me just say, Greg, we're happy to go a little. We're really happy to have you and Becca. We're good with going a little bit into overtime since we have you here. If you're okay with that, then
yeah, I can go a little bit over. I see a couple more questions.
Yes, indeed. Go ahead.
Some people with intellectual and developmental disability develop a dual diagnosis, including mental health. Are there family groups for this group? We don't have a specific support group for family members of individuals with dual diagnosis. I think it's a great idea. But we'd be happy to talk through what options are out there for people who have co-occurring mental illness and intellectual and developmental disabilities. There are specific programs for that population, so happy to have a conversation on the side about that. The question is, do you have outreach in Spanish? We do have programming offered in Spanish. We have a Spanish language family support group once a month, and then the local NAMIs across the state also, some of them have programming that's offered in Spanish language. So great question. I appreciate that, and it's certainly something we need to do more of. So thank you for that great question.
Greg, I'd like to ask you a question. I'm at the Brazos County Courts of Law in Bryan, and have worked on guardianship matters involving people with mental illness for 25, 26 years now. Here at our courts, I mean, I've heard some judges say in the past, the court just won't consider a guardianship on someone with mental illness. They're all unmanageable. And then there are others that really don't differentiate between that diagnosis versus others. In our courts, we have found that we can have success. We don't always have success. The case that always comes to my mind is Brian Wilson of the Beach Boys, who had really, really serious schizoaffective disorder, temporary guardianship and intervention that lasted about 5 years. Medication was managed, business affairs were managed, and now for the better part of 30 years, he has been out performing and doing the kinds of things that only Brian Wilson can do with all of his talent. So often we will take a graduated approach to a guardianship involving someone with mental illness, maybe initially appoint a guardian ad litem, maybe consider a temporary guardianship to see if we can fine-tune the situation to make it workable for the person who may need the assistance of the court. And then some small percentage, we end up with successful guardianships, and then there are a fair number that, we try and don't. What is your feeling about courts, practitioners taking that sort of more graduated approach to these kinds of scenarios versus maybe cases with other diagnoses?
It sounds to me like it makes a lot of sense. And I think about the reality that, putting in place a highly restrictive measure for a person with serious mental illness can exacerbate the experience of having that SMI. And so, I think there's something to be said for shying away from the heavy-handed approach to the extent that we can. because this is an especially marginalized population. These are people who have been through the system and have always been told what to do from a very top-down perspective. So, you know, perhaps an intermediary sort of measure is the right move, and then the situation can be stabilized. They will voluntarily engage in a treatment plan, and there's no need for a long-term full guardianship to be put in place for that person. That's just my, gut instinct to the concept. I can't say that I have a lot of familiarity with how that works in the court system, but I support that approach just based on how you described it. I think that's great.
Very good, thank you.
And the other thing I want to say, as it relates to the judicial system and mental illness, is we do now have a judicial commission on mental health in the state of Texas, and that's a joint effort by the Texas Supreme Court and Texas Court of Criminal Appeals, and it's really covering all areas of the law affecting mental illness within the court system. And this, so it's criminal courts, it's probate courts, it's family law courts. They're taking a comprehensive look at the system. And so I think that may be something to keep an eye on and perhaps engage with, because all of these systems are interconnected in one way or another. And so I think we all need to be working together. Very
good. All right. Fred, before I close out, would you like to make any, can you explain to people how the CEUs are handled and all of that?
Yes, so for anybody that wants to obtain a CEU or the MCLE, they can reach out to me via email, which everybody should have it. I did email you all this morning. And there is a small fee for the CEU or MCLE, which is going to be about $25. But that can be handled through our office. So if you want to give me a call, or I'm sorry, email me, you're more than welcome to do that. My email address is, I'll actually put it in the chat box here so you can reach out to me.
All right, thank you. Well, Greg, thank you and Becca both for joining us today. This has been a really wonderful presentation and I think extremely helpful for members of the Texas Guardianship Association. We look forward to collaborating with you again on future matters and issues, and especially with the legislative session coming up. I'm sure there'll be a lot of things coming up as well. Anything last minute y'all would like to add?
No, thank you so much for having us. We appreciate it.